So in the last lecture, we were talking about World War I, how and why it emerged, and most importantly, how the United States got involved in this war. What we're going to be talking about in this segment is how the war affects the life in the United States on a domestic level. In other words, how this changes things for people living in the United States. Okay. Now, the most important thing that I need to press upon you about this change in American life is that World War I expands the role of the federal government. And I want you to write that down. World War I produces a bigger, stronger, more intrusive federal government. For good, better, or worse, it does grow the power and the size of the federal government. Okay? Why? Well, if it was just organized on a region-by-region basis, in other words, if New England, for example, just really rallied to the cause of World War I, was that really going to be enough to put the United States and their allies over the hump when it comes to winning the war? Probably not, right? The federal government, the simple fact of the matter is that the federal government was the only institution in American life with the capacity, with the resources, and with the wherewithal to organize effectively for a war effort. I'll give you a really quick for instance. One of the things that we had to do when it comes to fighting the war was pay for it. We had to find a way to buy bullets and guns and commission soldiers and to produce planes and, well, to a lesser extent planes, but certainly ships. And all that money had to come from somewhere. And so one of the things that the government issued in World War I was the 16th Amendment. Okay? Now the 16th Amendment basically gives us an income tax. Now for the most part, you and I probably would have been safe from this income tax, considering it more or less targeted very, very wealthy Americans and corporations. Okay? But in addition to an expansion of the federal government by taxing people's incomes, the government also sold liberty loans. Now, this was basically an opportunity to invest in America's war effort, and considering Uncle Sam had crystal clear credit at the time, it was also a good business opportunity. But really, these liberty loans sold very, very well in immigrant communities where people were eager to demonstrate how patriotic they were, how 100% American that they were, and what better way to do that than actually help the United States finance this war. Okay? But on one of the most basic levels, one of the things that the government was going to have to do was regulate the economy. I mean, we had this great industrial economy. We produced and we produced and we produced. We produced so much that most of the time we couldn't consume all of it, right? That's going to give you a huge advantage when it comes to warfare. But the fact of the matter is, there needs to be somebody in charge, okay? And so what I need you to understand to that end is that the government was pretty much in charge of telling private producers, like Henry Ford, for example, what they had to produce, how much of it they had to produce, and what they were going to get paid for it. Now, the government did this through an organization called the War Industries Board, or the WIB. Now, the job of the WIB was really twofold. It was, first of all, to relegate resources to make sure that we had enough to eat here at home, enough to survive here at home, but we also were able to feed our armies, we were able to supply, to equip our armies, and also the armies of our allies as well. The other job of the WIB is to force private producers, people like Henry Ford, force them to produce for the war instead of producing for a civilian market. In other words, Henry Ford's going to stop producing Model T cars, and it's going to start producing Jeeps and ships and guns and other things that are useful to winning the war. Right? I'll give you a really good case in point, this government power to force people to do things. Herbert Hoover, a name that you'll be very familiar with in the coming weeks. Herbert Hoover was in charge of a government agency called the Food Administration. And the Food Administration did exactly what you think it does. It made sure that we had enough food to go around. Our armies had enough and the civilian population had enough. Now, Herbert Hoover took his job very, very serious, and even though he had the power to come in and tell people, you can't eat red meat on Monday, for example, you cannot do it, he did not want to do that. Hoover felt, as you will come to see, that what made America great was the fact that the government took a back seat and didn't stand over shoulders and tell American citizens exactly how every minute detail of their life had to be planned out for them. Okay? Hoover appealed to something called voluntarism. Okay? He wanted the United States, the people of the United States, to voluntarily give up specific foods, voluntarily kind of contract on various consumption habits, voluntarily make sacrifices for the greater good of the war effort. And so what they ultimately came up with was a campaign that came to be known as Food Will Win the War. Now, on various days, they appealed to the patriotism of Americans. Don't eat this particular kind of food. They had meatless Mondays, they had wheatless Tuesdays, porkless Wednesdays, and right down the list. And what it was doing is trying to tap into American patriotism by trying to say, look, we need to make sure our fighting men have enough to eat, and so therefore, out of patriotism, we're all voluntarily going to avoid eating meat on Monday, and this is going to conserve resources. Okay? And he was very highly successful and very well thought of by the time that the war ended. Okay? So even though that you do have an expansion of the war, an expansion of the government, you've got officials, including Herbert Hoover, that want to use that as sort of like a last effort, a last resort effort to get the Henry Fords and the American citizens of the world to kind of cooperate with this war effort. Okay. Now, the other thing that I'd like you to understand is you can have all the WIBs in the world. It's not going to amount to anything unless you have people on the inside of the factory that are producing morning, noon, and night. Now, when people like Ford would balk at the idea of switching over to wartime production, in other words, producing Jeeps instead of Model Ts, the government made them an offer that they couldn't refuse. The government said, look, you're going to have a monopoly on the best customer in the world. The U.S. government is the best customer anywhere in the world. We'll guarantee your profits. You don't have to compete with anybody. You don't have to be the best price in town. You just have to produce military equipment. That was all fine and well, but in order to keep the workers on the inside of the factory working, you had to give them something that they wanted as well. Well, if you're somebody like Jurgis Rudkis, the main character in The Jungle, what was something that you would really, really want? One of the things that I would really want would be a union. Something, some institution, a powerful institution to speak up on my behalf, to lobby for better wages, shorter work days, better working conditions, a voice on the factory floor. And so what the government does through another Washington agency called the National Labor Relations Board, it pretty much says if your employer accepts federal money, if he or she is a factory that's producing for the war effort, we guarantee that that employer will recognize your union. And so one of the things that comes out of World War I are thousands and thousands of thousands of dues-paying, card-carrying union members. Okay? So organized labor is really looking at the future and thinking, finally, the federal government is on our side. I mean, for years and years and years, it was a source of oppression. It was busting up unions and pretty much forcing people back to work. And now we have the political blessing, or at least they thought they had the political blessing. So there's a lot of workers that are looking at the future, the 1920s and beyond, with very high hopes and very high expectations. Another group of Americans with high hopes and high expectations would be African Americans. I guess you could make the case of people of color generally speaking, because one of the things that is beginning to happen in the war years, World War I years, is you're seeing something called the Great Migration. Conditions in the South for African Americans were just oppressive. They were just horrible, horrible social, economic, political conditions. For the most part, you had no political voice. We understand that one of the things that happened in the aftermath of Reconstruction was that African American men were, for the most part, disfranchised. Their votes were taken away from them. We know that racism imposed this brutal racial caste system in which black was not only separated from white, but for the most part, opportunity was segmented for African Americans. And so, to maybe the same extent in the Southwest, you've got some of these other very, very oppressive conditions for Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants, and, well, I should probably say Mexican nationals that are working in the United States, and also American born people of Mexican ancestry. What's beginning to happen as the war breaks out are people in the South, and to a lesser extent the Southwest, are beginning to relocate to the urban North and Midwest. Chicago is seeing a massive influx of people. Detroit is seeing a massive influx of people. New York is seeing a huge number of people flocking to there because those places are centers of production for the war effort. So the Great Migration is really two things. One, it's one of the biggest migrations in American history where African Americans are coming up from the South, Mexican Americans are coming up from the Southwest to take advantage of those industrial, better paying jobs. And it's also a way of escaping these socially, politically, economically oppressive conditions that had existed in places like Birmingham, Alabama for generations. Okay? The last group that I want you to be mindful of when it comes to high hopes and high expectations for the future, that would be women. Okay? Now, many of the men that were working in the factory in 1916 had enlisted in the war effort, not effort, but had enlisted in the military, and had been shipped overseas. And even with the Great Migration, this is creating a huge need for labor in the North. And so one of the people that's going to fill this void is going to be American women. Now, we've talked about the cult of domesticity. Talked about how even though many American females worked, there was an expectation that women were really not cut out for various kinds of jobs, including jobs in heavy industry. Well, those stereotypes are going to be shattered during the war when women are going to enter into the paid workforce and really replace a lot of these men in heavy industry. Okay, so one of the things that's going to come out of World War I is a much more invigorated women's movement. I don't think it's any coincidence whatsoever that women get the vote in 1920, considering what had been building up into that year, and the war years are very much a part of that equation. Women had begun to enter into the paid workforce and had gotten a taste of that autonomy and demanded more rights in their day-to-day operations of the way that the government worked. Okay. So anyway, keep that in the forefront of your mind. Workers, people of color, and women are looking at the future with high hopes and high expectations. On an aside, you're also seeing a kind of a cultural revolution that's coming to the fore in the aftermath of World War I. Those of you that have taken an art class or taken a literature class would probably be able to tell me a little bit about modernism. Now, the first thing that I need you to know about modernism was that it was an international cultural movement. Its influences, which really began in Europe and made their way over to the United States, its influences was things like industrialization, urbanization, and especially World War I. World War I was the first instance of mass death in the 20th century, and it had a huge influence on many cultural expressionists, including a guy by the name of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because Fitzgerald is the guy that wrote a book called The Great Gatsby. And for those of you that have read Great Gatsby, or maybe seen the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Great Gatsby, you'll know that it's very critical of American consumer culture. That one of the things that you're supposed to do by the 1920s is go out there and buy and buy and buy and buy and buy. And, the main character, Gatsby, in that book, he's a World War I veteran. But his problem is he's the wrong guy for the girl that he fell in love with, Daisy. And the reason why is beyond his control. He's wasn't born into his riches. He made it on his own. right? He was a self-made millionaire. And so Fitzgerald is really at the forefront of this criticism of American consumer culture, which was really central to the modernist movement when it comes to American cultural expression at the end of World War I and especially throughout the 1920s, early 1920s, I guess I should say. But back to our story about high hopes and high expectations. As these expectations rose in the black community, for instance, it challenged white supremacy in non-traditional white supremacist states. And by states, I mean locations. One example would be East St. Louis, Missouri in 1917. Riots broke out when white workers felt that blacks were being given preferential hiring treatment at defense factories. And what you had was armed mobs going into the black community and beating people up indiscriminately. And instead of running and hiding, instead of just trying to lay low for the time being, you see African Americans fighting back. Same thing's happening in Chicago. There's a huge strain for civil resources, recreation, housing, jobs, all these things were much more competitive after you see this huge influx of African American immigrants. And so when you would have a white mob that would invade the south side of Chicago, the main black district, you would see these black mobs responding with violence or to violence with more violence. And so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for black people to be beating up white people in mob violence formats. What we call this is something called the New Negro, okay? Now, what the New Negro means is a newfound racial assertiveness in the black community. No longer are African Americans simply rolling over and hiding it out for this violence to pass. They're essentially giving as much as they're taking. So the white community responds with violence, the black community meets that violence with violence of their own. It's a newfound racial assertiveness. It comes from the experience of fighting in the war. It comes from the experience of working in a defense factory. In other words, we're over here fighting to make the world safe for democracy. We're fighting for the good guys, and the very least that the good guys could do is offer us first-class citizenship rights in return. Okay? So this expectation that life is going to be different in a good way amongst the African American community is not exactly going to be a universal truth, and we can clearly see that with the race riots of 1917 and 1919. We also see some political fallout. Right? Keep in mind, one of the things that came out of World War I was thousands and thousands and thousands of dues-paying Union members. And in the aftermath of the war, Woodrow Wilson pretty much says all of these wartime measures, wartime regulations, all of them are going to pretty much be temporary. And if you don't want to keep unions in your shops, if you're Andrew Carnegie or Henry Ford, you don't have to do that, right? And so basically everybody that's anybody pretty much washes their hands of unionism in the aftermath of World War I. Well, this produces a whole lot of labor strife. You've got workers by the thousands that are walking off their jobs. For instance, in Seattle, Washington, which had always been a very heavily unionized town, there was a general strike. I mean, they pretty much shut down the entire city of Seattle. Okay. Now, there's another dynamic to this that I want you to be mindful of as well, and that would be the Red Scare. Okay. Now, remember, 1917 is the Bolshevik Revolution. And what happens in the aftermath of that is the Russian Communist Party sets up something called the International, or the Comintern. And the point of the Comintern is to export communism to every corner of the globe. Now, those of you that have ever read Karl Marx or know a thing or two about communism, what it wants to do is to spread to as many countries as possible, because what it's trying to produce is a classless, working class utopia, right? Where everybody has enough to eat and everybody has enough to survive, and we're going to eliminate the ownership of private property, private factories, and the government's going to own everything. Sounds great on paper, and it's much more difficult to implement than it is on paper. But at any rate, what the Russian Communist Party understands is if it just stays in Russia, if communism is just staying in Russia, it's not going to make a difference one way or another. It wants to spread everywhere, including the United States. So in 1919, communism does come to America's shores. In Chicago, in 1919, we see the emergence of the American Communist Party, the CPUSA. The Communist Party, as its mission, has dedicated itself to the overthrow of the American government. It wants to overthrow the American government by any means necessary, including violence, like what happened with the Bolshevik Revolution, and it wants to implement a communist regime, okay, to produce this classless society. This is fairly radical, not fairly, it's very radical, very scary stuff. Take that and couple it with some of the labor strife that's going on that year, and you've got a very scary situation. The Attorney General at the time was a guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer, and what happened in 1919 after the emergence of communism in the United States was a bomb went off in his house. Now, fortunately, nobody was seriously injured, but Palmer felt that this could only be the work of communists. So what he did was commission something that comes to be known as the Palmer Raids, right? He sent hundreds of federal agents out into the American society, and their mission was to basically arrest communists, people that had been behind the plot to blow up his house. Unfortunately, this ultimately degenerates into more or less a dragnet, right? Anybody that is even remotely, close to the situation as it involves radicalism, they're going to be locked up in this dragnet. You're going to have people that are going to be pretty much innocent of everything that are going to be drugged in front of a court and arrested. And so the Palmer raids are an expansion of the government, and they're responding to that Red Scare, that intense fear of radicalism and communism that is apparent in the aftermath of the war. Now, if you think about communism and socialism and anarchism and some of the other isms that we've talked about in this class before, many of them are coming from Europe, in particular Central and Southern Europe. Okay? Now, a case in point would be the case of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, right? Now, as you might imagine, these two guys are Italian immigrants, and in 1920 they are accused of murdering their boss in Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. Okay? Now, it's probably also important that you know that both of these guys were self-professed anarchists. They wanted to destroy the American government. And at the time of their arrest, both men were armed. When they went to trial, the trial was much more about their radicalism, the fact that they were open about being anarchists and favored the overthrow of the American government. And so therefore, in the minds of the prosecuting attorneys, that in and of itself made them guilty of murder, made them at least capable of murder. There was very little concrete smoking gun evidence that links Sacco and Vanzetti to the scene of the crime, but at the same time, what happens to them is they're ultimately convicted of murder and they are executed. And so what I want to leave you with is that World War I produced this really ugly, really, to some extent, scary kind of situation where you've got anti-radicalism, anti-immigrant sentiment that's sweeping across the nation. Clearly that can be seen in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. But at any rate, that's where I'm going to leave the discussion when it comes to the legacy of World War I. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the 1920s, which are going to be a really important time period for our class because it's going to be a really dramatic departure from the way that politics and the way that international relations were conducted up to that point. And to that extent, World War I is going to play a very important role when it comes to this change of heart.